Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us for today's webinar on software asset management beyond compliance. Today is an educational webinar, and I really very much appreciate your taking the time to join us. The webinar today is going to be conducted and hosted by Sherry Irwin, an expert in this maturing discipline. I'll introduce you quickly here to Sherry. She is the founder and president of Technology Asset Management Incorporated and has over 30 years of experience in IT asset management, including license, contract, and vendor management across a broad spectrum of industries. She's widely recognized as a pioneer, expert, educator, and advocate in this maturing discipline. In addition to her consulting and education practice, Sherry, as far back as 1992, she founded and is the chair of the Canadian IT Asset Management Users Group. She's an ITAM fellow and recognized as an industry leader and advocate. She's also a Canadian delegate to the ISO IEC 19770 IT Asset Management Standards Development. And Sherry is a former Gartner consultant, a former advisor to clients of Giga Information Group's research and advisory services as a Giga expert and consultant. So we are clearly in very qualified and safe hands. And with that, Sherry, I am going to turn things over to you in order to tell us a little bit more about software asset management beyond compliance.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello and welcome, everyone. As with most things in life and business, IT asset management, including software asset and license management, SAM, success depends in part on setting appropriate expectations with stakeholders and a common understanding of key concepts. Unfortunately, too many ITAM initiatives fail or do not fully realize the benefits. Some organizations, in fact, are on their second or third attempt. The inability, perhaps the unwillingness, to differentiate SAM in particular and its subsets is one of the reasons these initiatives often fail to meet those expectations, and for some of the market confusion as well as to solutions. This session will address foundational concepts for ITAM and SAM, as well as the important distinction between SAM and two of its subsets, software license management and software license compliance. I'll also share selected best practices as may be helpful in planning and executing your programs and identifying appropriate solutions for your requirements. To those ends, if we can go, we are at the agenda here. The things I'll cover basically are the what and the why and the how of ITAM and SAM in particular. And at the end, I want to touch briefly on the industry standard 19770 as to ITAM. First, it's essential we define what we mean by an IT asset, which may be different than the definition other areas use, in particular finance. As to ITAM, from an ITAM-centric view, I define assets as hardware and software acquired from an external party in some manner, whether it's a purchase, lease, in the case of software, typically a license. It may be rental and so forth. This definition, by definition, excludes in-house developed applications other than the components of those applications that include licensed software. We also include in that definition and the scope related services such as maintenance and support on those IT assets, and in more recent years, services that include access to software owned by an external party, whether or not there's any software on client devices. So what I'm talking about here is the cloud, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, etc. IT assets, beyond the assets themselves, that being the primary portfolio, ITAM needs to consider related entities, secondary or ancillary portfolios of things about which we need information that's critical in different ways to being proactive in managing our asset portfolio. So, for example, as to software, we need to know the license information. For all IT assets, we need to know about the contracts, the terms and conditions, the financials, what did we pay, what historically? What are we committed to pay in future? The organization, departments, subsidiaries, affiliates, etc., and other entities. I also note that IT assets and services are what provide the business value, the desired end result. And sometimes we forget that. Contracts and vendors are the means by which we bring in, acquire IT assets and services and provide them to the business. So I think that's an important distinction here, that end result versus means in other areas in ITAM. So having defined what we mean by IT assets, next we'll define IT asset management. And there are two parts to that. IT asset tracking, which is basic, is the lifecycle tracking, control, and analysis of IT assets. This is more of a physical, technical, and operational view of the assets. What do we have? Where is it? Make, model, manufacturer, publisher, etc. The concept of life cycle is very important, from conception to grave. That applies to tracking, and also as we move into the next point, moving into asset management, where we go beyond the physical into the fiscal, where we bring in additionally procurement, contract, vendor, financial, and organization details. Again, a fiscal, more business view of our assets. Asset management is also a framework. I'll cover that on a later slide. It's a program, meaning it doesn't end. It is ongoing. It is perpetual. It is, while there may be projects needed to develop and implement an ITAM program, and those projects would end at some point, the program itself is ongoing. And it's a set of business practices within that framework. I've included here as well two definitions, the second from the ISO ITAM standard. I have some issue with that in any different definition, for that matter, that uses the term management as part of defining a management function. However, I think it's important that you be familiar with that definition. And in the graphic there, again, I'm making the distinction between the fiscal and the physical. Physical is tracking what we have installed, what we've used, and possibly even what is permitted per organization policy. And then the fiscal goes beyond that, again, bringing in the financial, the contractual, the legal, perhaps regulatory, etc. So why are we doing asset management or considering it? Well, as always, a focus has been to control and avoid life cycle costs associated with our investments in IT assets. So, primarily what are called green dollars that actually leave the organization being paid to an external party, licenses, purchases, maintenance, etc. But also some of the internal, more soft costs in that life cycle. And you may have seen this quote in the box here from Gartner. Enterprises that begin an ITAM program experience up to a 30% reduction in costs in the first year, savings of 5 to 10% for the next 5 years. That's a guideline. You need to do some analysis to find out to what extent those numbers might apply to all, or more likely subsets of your asset portfolio. As always, or certainly for many years, ITAM and SAM specifically has been about mitigating risk related to license compliance, specifically ensuring that you are in compliance with the license agreements. And there's a lot of focus on that in the industry, driven in large part by publishers and compliance organizations. ITAM also provides support for both IT and non-IT functions, primarily as to data that is useful to those functions, but also through process and policy, some controls that might not otherwise exist. IT functions would include, for example, planning and budgeting, the change management process. By that I mean installs, moves, adds, deinstalls, disposals, commonly referred to as IMAC-Ds. In terms of non-IT functions, finance, procurement, contract and vendor management, even legal as examples. And again, with that data, ITAM facilitates sometimes very complex analysis and decisions, and ideally in a proactive manner versus reactive. In more recent years, and as an ITAM program matures, we look to other types of risks to mitigate. Risks as to the contract more broadly, not just the licenses as part of the contract. Regulations, legislation, and internal policies. And then a major focus driver for ITAM in the last 18 months or so is as to security, and particularly cybersecurity. We can't secure what we don't know we have, or what we can't locate. So it's important to have at least basic asset tracking to provide that information to assess the level of security in our environment, identify holes in the security, and mitigate those risks. And last but certainly not least, again, as the program matures, our focus expands beyond cost and risk to value. So now that we know what we spend, we've minimized our cost, we've mitigated our risks, how can we get more value from what we continue to spend on our IT assets? And there are different ways to do that. We can improve or increase the use of an asset. We can exploit capability that we may not be using today, but we're paying for. Redeploy, of course, underutilized assets or assets that aren't used at all. So I've talked about the what and the why. This is a bit about the how, the program framework. So the framework, think of it as a building structure without the finishing touches or contents, so things like rooms and floors and walls, etc. Best practices are within the detailed design or content of this framework. So there are 5 foundational components represented by the 5 circles around the red circle, which is in red because ITAM is the heart of this framework. That's how I view it. But the circles surrounding it as follows. We have policies, both governance policies, which typically span the corporation, the organization broadly. And we have operational policies, which may be more specific to a functional area or a specific process. Then we have lifecycle processes, not all of which are equally important to the ITAM objectives. We have data, and not just asset data. We are concerned about those secondary ancillary portfolios of data, as I mentioned earlier, license data, financial data, contract data, and so on. Supporting technologies, including products such as those from Vector. In different categories, we have what I consider to be tools which automate what is otherwise a manual function, so inventory discovery, usage metering, software packaging and distribution as examples. And then we have what I consider to be applications, business applications in support of ITAM. And that would be primarily your asset and license repository, where you capture that view of what you've acquired, and a related software license optimization technology. It could arguably fall in either category. And last but certainly not least, as part of the framework, is roles and accountabilities, the people aspect. So who, in what roles, or what roles do we need with what accountabilities and responsibilities, where do they reside, who do they report to, etc. And for all of these program components, we are tracking and recording. We're capturing data. We're monitoring and measuring against any number of metrics of effectiveness and efficiency, and we're analyzing and reporting. And then, of course, there's a governance layer, which may be primarily through policy. The last piece is a supporting toolkit. This is a set of documents in support of your ITAM program, typically checklists and templates, standard documents that in some way standardize, ensure consistency and completeness and thoroughness in what you're doing. An example would be a contract checklist, a checklist of terms and conditions that you would want to at least consider, possibly negotiate in your license agreements. And this framework, by the way, as I note here, it applies to other disciplines. It's not conceptually, it's not specific to ITAM. Aligned with that framework, I've noted a number of common challenges here, and the ones I've listed on the slide are really internal to the organization. What we need to remember in the box there is that there are external factors, new technologies, new vendors, acquisitions where vendors are being acquired by other vendors, you're discontinuing products, bringing in new products, trends such as license compliance audits as an example, where it's necessary to understand what those industry events, trends, etc. are and what the impact is to your organization and your asset portfolio. Internally, we have people challenges, multiple interest groups with conflicting objectives. So for example, we've got finance concerned with accounting and legal obligations. We've got IT operations concerned with service levels and providing service to clients, to name just a couple. Decentralized or rogue purchasing, not going through a central process such that there are appropriate controls, where there are appropriate controls and capture of key data. Shadow IT, no accountability. Ignorance is a key one that people don't understand what is needed and what's expected of them and why. So some of ITAM success is education and awareness. Policy and process, inadequate control over deployment, software deployment in particular. We need to have controls on who can deploy software, where it goes, to make sure that we are licensed appropriately for that environment, for that device. Processes are still very manual in a lot of cases. Little or no automation, very little integration for automated workflow and data exchange. So we've got redundant data, inconsistent data as a result. And then we've got more and more and different devices coming into the environment with added complexity, about which we need to control those, but we also need data about them. And on the data and technology side, I've probably covered some of these points. Either no tools or tools are not implemented effectively. There's no integration. We don't have documentation. So whether it's proof of license as an example, contracts, etc. We don't have that information in any form. We're not capturing the necessary data, particularly around licenses. We don't have a central repository. And as part of data generally, and the repository in particular, a data model and standards. We need to ensure we're capturing our data in a consistent manner so that we can use that data in a meaningful way. And another aspect on the data and technology side is that it can be a significant investment of cost, not just for the technology to license solutions and the services needed to help configure and implement those solutions, but internal costs as well. So these and other things have been and continue to be a challenge for many organizations as to ITAM. So this slide talks to the concept of SAM having subsets that are different in terms of scope and purpose. So as per the graphic there, we start with ITAM in the red, which includes hardware and software and services, everything that I defined earlier. Then we get into SAM as a subset. This is the green, which is specific to software assets and licenses. We do need basic hardware asset tracking in support of SAM. We may not need full-blown hardware asset management, but certainly the tracking. Why? Because we need to know the configuration, the characteristics, and the location of the devices on which the software is being deployed in order to determine compliance or ensure it compliance. Then we have software license management in the purple, which is a subset of SAM. I include software license optimization here, SLO. And finally, we have software license compliance in the turquoise, SLC, as a subset of SLM. And if we move to the next slide, I'll clarify, explain why and how they're different. So if we start with SLC in the turquoise, our main objective with SLC is to ensure that we are not under-licensed, that we have enough of the right type of licenses to be compliant with our license agreements. We want to minimize, as a result or through that, the maybe not so much the likelihood, but the impact of a license compliance audit by a third party, and thereby avoid unbudgeted expense related to true-ups and even penalties, and avoid legal and reputational risk. So our focus again here is that we're not under-licensed. As we go up to the purple, software license management, our objective expands. We're now concerned as well that we aren't over-licensed. And for some products in particular, that is very common, that we have too much of them, too many licenses, or we're over-licensed not just in quantity, but in capability. So instead of standard edition, we've got enterprise edition, when in fact standard edition would suffice at a lower cost. So our objective here is to make sure that we're right licensed. And again, we want to avoid costs, a different type of cost here. Again, is it the right product that we're licensing so we're not overpaying for more capability than what is needed and more complexity than what is needed as well. And then as we get into SAM, the green, it's all of the below plus a greater focus on the assets, not just the licenses. So do we have the right products to meet the business need? Are there newer products in the marketplace? Do we have a roadmap for the products that we have? Can we reduce the complexity in our environment? Do we have redundancies in our products? How many database management systems, for example, do we have? Can we standardize, reduce down to a few? What can we do not only to reduce costs, but to maximize the value that we're getting from the capability, the function of the software that we've invested in? Is there more we can do to support other functions? And these things really have, yes, the license is relevant, but it is over and above and beyond the license. I won't go through the various considerations here. I think I've talked to most of them. But again, as you go up this scale, it's from focus on not being under licensed to being right licensed, and then ultimately, do we have the right assets, software assets in our portfolio? And this is an important consideration. Why? Why do I make this point? Let's go to the next slide. So if you look at the box on the right, what I find is, first of all, most SAM or ITAM professionals focus or should be focused on governance and policy and process, that framework, not licensing. Licensing, of course, is a part of SAM, but the ITAM and SAM analysts, managers, they need an understanding, a basic understanding of licensing, but not the intricate details. But what I see frequently in terms of job postings for ITAM or SAM professionals, if you look at the second one, for example, ITAM analyst, specific expertise in one of the following domains, IBM, Oracle, etc. Review contracts to determine entitlements. That's really license compliance, possibly into license management. It really isn't ITAM. It's not even SAM. The services one, let me talk to that. Outsourcing. So this is where you've got a contractor with an external party. The outsourcer will be responsible for IT asset management, specifically maintaining an inventory of installed hardware and software. Well, as I've explained, and hopefully you understand, ITAM is more than maintaining an inventory of installed hardware and software. That's asset tracking. And if that's all you need from the outsourcer, that's fine. But the contract should read as such, and they should be compensated accordingly. The SAM managed services, the last one there. The MSP is responsible for fulfillment of approved software license requests and license tracking. Well, again, fulfillment is just one part of the overall life cycle. There are many more things that happen relevant to SAM in the life cycle beyond fulfillment, and it's not covered here. So why does this matter? Bottom line is we need to understand the objectives and the scope of what we're doing so that we can set appropriate expectations as to the results, the impacts, the effort, etc. And based on that, establish the appropriate plans and budgets and program framework. Get the right resources, provide the appropriate training, make sure that we know what data we need and we're capturing that data. And what technology we need in support of the program and capture and use of that data. Also to know, again, depending on the scope, is it SLC, software license compliance, or is it SAM, what areas are going to be impacted, or what areas do we have requirements of that we need something from, whether it's data or policy, whatever it may be, aligned with that framework. If we don't define our objectives and scope correctly, then there's a great potential for getting it wrong and for failure. So these things to me do matter, and it is a problem in the industry right now. And as I said earlier, also in terms of understanding what technology you need and acquiring the right technology to meet your requirements. Another point to consider in terms of ITAM is, and this applies of course to SAM, is that there are a number of functional interdependencies. What do I mean by that? Given the life cycle nature of ITAM, there are many other areas that have a role in that life cycle, including within IT, corporate functions such as procurement and legal and HR, the business, but also external service providers and consultants. So ITAM has dependencies on these other functional areas, which means there are requirements of these other functional areas. And there may be impacts, but we also need to remember that it's not just a one-way, that in fact ITAM can provide value. So it's important to put together, basically it's a matrix identifying these functional areas, what the level of dependency is, what ITAM needs from those areas, what ITAM can provide from those to those areas, and proceed accordingly. And a good example is change management, and I'm referring here again to IMAC-D, change management as to the IT assets. That is a huge challenge, and sometimes what I do in a consulting assignment is we need to fix change management before we can be successful with ITAM and SAM. So we need to, through change management, make sure that the changes that are being planned, considered, costed, take into account contract and legal restrictions, additional costs that there may be for license upgrades or new licenses, etc. And often that does not happen. But it is a critical control point to proactive management. Next two slides are just selected representative best practices, again aligned with the program framework. I probably mentioned a few of them already in my discussion, and I won't repeat them. But in terms of the how, the program and strategy, you need to define the mandate. What is the reason for ITAM or SAM to exist? And in support, what is our strategy, our plan, and the commitment from stakeholders? And I don't mean just a verbal commitment. I'm talking about funding and resources, visibility into steering committees, and planning committees, other forums that exist in the organization. You need to track and report relevant metrics in two categories. One is effectiveness of the ITAM and SAM program. So are we accomplishing the business objectives, whether it's cost reduction, license compliance, whatever. And the other is efficiency. So how efficient are we in meeting those objectives in our effectiveness? We can be highly license compliant, but if it takes us, 5 people dedicated full time, then we're not very efficient. So we need to consider both aspects. The toolkit is very key, as I mentioned earlier, to standardize, to make sure that we don't miss things, whether it's, in contracting, perhaps invoice verification, financial analysis, and many others. The next point is the importance I alluded to earlier of maintaining an external industry view, not just knowing what's going on in the organization in terms of plans and issues and so forth, but the things that are happening in the industry that have the potential to impact cost, risk, viability of suppliers and technology, etc. So you need to be proactive in that regard, understand that impact and formulate action and appropriate response. From an organization perspective, centralization is key, at least for governance purposes, with sufficient staff at a high enough level in the organization that they have some influence or adequate influence over other parts of IT and through senior management, non-IT functions. The operations, some of the operational aspects of ITAM may be decentralized, but the governance definitely needs to be centralized. And it's a business management function. It is not, and that may be within IT, it is not a technical or operational department. Assign asset and related portfolios to specific resources. What I'm talking about here is that you have one, sometimes it's more dedicated resources to the Microsoft portfolio, for example, to IBM. So they understand that, they live it, they breathe it, they know it well. And somewhat related is to assign asset roles. There's a whole discussion around roles, such as, I'll use the term owner. Who owns this asset or category of assets? For example, database management systems. I don't like to use the term ownership because it's really the organization that is the owner. Custodian is another term, or steward. There are other roles, and it's important to, useful to identify those and make sure everyone knows what their role and responsibility is. Policies and processes, I'll just mention a few points here. It is important to manage at an appropriate level. Not all assets need to be managed to the same degree. Take a monitor, for example. We probably don't need to track a monitor through the entire life cycle. We need to know what came in when, what did we pay for it, and then at the end of the life cycle to know where it went, and specifically that we have proof that it was disposed of in an environmentally proper way. The cost to track a monitor through the entire life cycle is probably prohibitive and in most cases not justified. So give some thought to criteria that help you identify which assets to manage to what degree. There should be repercussions for non-compliance with policy or process. We need to get involved in IT planning and contracting. Be aware of what people are looking at doing and what the ramifications might be, especially from a licensing perspective, and have some input, including to contracting. What terms and conditions would we like to see in license agreements that are going to make it easier for us to maintain compliance, to be flexible in where we deploy software and who can use it. Historical documentation is key. There's often gold in historical documentation. So particularly when products or companies have been acquired by others, and there's a history there that may be different from the current situation. Verify invoices. This is beyond ensuring that the cost, the dollar amount is correct, which is what typically happens in a three-way match. What I'm talking about here with software specifically, they're often terms on the invoices that don't correspond to what you negotiated in your license agreements or what is in the license agreement. And since invoices are proof of license, it is critical that invoices are accurate. And there's a large percentage of them that are not, particularly for software, particularly where the terms have been negotiated and or the software has been acquired perhaps multiple times over the years. It's useful to charge back non-standard or expensive assets. It's very important to manage communications with suppliers. We're getting into here supplier or vendor management. And in particular, to ensure that all staff have some guidelines as to what's appropriate to share with suppliers and not. Without getting into a lot of detail, I've seen several times where a technical person has provided some detail on a support call that triggered a license compliance audit. And the information that was asked and that was given in that support call had nothing to do with the problem at hand. So it went over and above and beyond, but it's not the technical person's fault. They didn't know any better. And last but not least, here is to manage tax obligations. Many organizations are overpaying or underpaying tax on software in particular, and that is also an exposure and possibly an unnecessary cost. Data and technology, I think I've covered most of this, the central repository, data standards. Make sure you're assessing data quality on a regular basis. Do you have the right data? Are all the data elements standard values? Are they populated if they should be, etc.? Integration with IT and business applications, if feasible and timely. Don't wait for integration with procurement as an example. That would be ideal, but you might wait for a very long time. So at the cost of missed opportunity and additional risk or cost. You need data that tells you what's planned, both as to your new existing assets, but ones that are being considered or new, what you own and the cost and the terms of that ownership, what's installed and what's used. Definitely need to provide meaningful analysis and reporting, and that's a good place to start. Ask the stakeholders, what information do you need about our IT assets, particularly at the executive level? And that's, again, a good starting place as you develop and implement your program and the technologies associated with it. As to software and license management specifically, it's not a discrete component of the program framework, but I think there's some points to be made here. Need to manage all entities, the software, the contract and the license, and even the media. The media, whether it's physical, not so much these days, or electronic, is a means by which to control what software is deployed where. Make sure you license based on need and value. Too often publishers are trying to oversell, discounts to buy more, reduced to reduce your administration potentially, or another example, to reduce your license compliance risk or audit risk. If you buy more, we won't come in and audit you for a period of time. But be careful not to over-license. You do want license terms that give you flexibility to deploy the software, use it where you need it, so it can be used by who needs it in the environment they need it in. Also that the licenses are predictable in terms of costs, future costs, and that it's relatively easy to comply. Eliminate or improve audit and penalty terms. Absolutely conduct internal self-audits. Perhaps you do 2 or 3 major publishers every quarter to assess your compliance, but also look for situations where you're over-licensed. Make everyone responsible for license compliance. Everyone has a role, and they need to be educated to that end. And as part of your toolkit, have a compliance audit response plan. When you get that demand letter from a publisher or a compliance organization, the steps that you need to go through are pretty much the same. People should not be scrambling. What do we do? Who do we need to talk to? How do we do this? It should be in a predefined audit response plan. So that summarizes representative best practices. This, I realize, is largely redundant with the best practices that I talked about earlier. The colored sections on the right there, again, are aligned with that program framework and the components in that framework. I'll just mention a couple of things in terms of the strategy, the how, the first point. How, if you can, identify a specific business problem and deal with that business problem in the context of ITAM or SAM, and demonstrate the return on that effort, that investment, and use that to fund longer-term, broader initiatives, and start to think more strategically versus tactically beyond that. What I wanted to point out here from an industry perspective, it's important that ITAM and SAM practitioners be aware that there are efforts to develop some standards in support of ITAM. The standard through the ISO is 19770. It was originally SAM, so specific to software. A year, maybe two ago, it was expanded and rebranded to cover ITAM, although not a lot of work has been done yet to incorporate hardware. The circled ones are ones that are the most active projects. I'm one of the Canadian representatives on here. You should be familiar with this enough to ask your publishers, your software publishers, and your your technology, your solution providers, if and how they support or plan to support, particularly 19770-2, which is a software identification tag that would be embedded in every deployment of software, and 19770-3, which is an entitlement schema, which is intended to capture license information that could be used to somewhat automate license reconciliations to determine your license position, whether you're over or under licensed. And I'd be happy to, if anyone has questions on that or any of the material, to get into more detail offline. And with that, I thank you for your time and your interest, and I will turn it back to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Sherry. That was that was excellent. Very, very helpful, very informative, great detail, great useful information. So thank you again for that very much. So we are going to take some questions in a few minutes or in a few moments, but just before we get to that, I do want to take an opportunity and a moment of your time to provide a couple of calls to action. The business value stakeholders that Sherry mentioned in the asset and software management arena can certainly benefit from both knowledge through training as well as tools, which can be used to support, of course, the processes that Sherry has discussed with us today. So from the knowledge and training perspective, excuse me, if you do want more information, more of what Sherry's had to offer today in much more detailed format, Sherry has some amazing training courses available, and for further information on those courses, you can use the contact information on this screen, and Sherry will be happy to help you out. Once you do have that knowledge, one of the next things that you're going to be looking for is a solution to support those efforts. Certainly we here at Vector offer a tool for consideration called Vizor. Vizor is a full-featured IT asset and software license management solution, and it can be explored through either a 14-day live evaluation period or through a personalized web demonstration. So if you want further information on either of those options for the Vizor IT asset and software license management solution, you can go ahead and refer to the information on the screen again, and feel free to contact us, and we'll certainly be happy to help. So with that, I would, we'll try to fit in a couple of questions here, and Sherry, if you've got some time for us, that would be great. I do have a question from Colin, comes in, and he's asking about, excuse me, sorry about that. He's asking about the costs associated with your training. So he says, what are the costs associated with your training services, Sherry?
So the course, the one-day course on contract management and vendor management, both integral to ITAM and SAM, is $899 per person, and that's Canadian. I am an accredited trainer also for the International Association of IT Asset Managers, ITAM, and offer 2 of their courses. The cost is for each course is 2 days. The cost for each course is $1,895. That includes the exam by which a student would become accredited as a certified software asset manager or a certified hardware asset management professional. And then the users group, that is $145 per person. It's a 1-day event held 3 times a year in Toronto. The spring meeting is June 14th, and I'd be happy to provide information on our agenda, which is nearly finalized to anyone who's interested. The users group is restricted to ITAM practitioners.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for that. We also have a very relevant and timely question from Patricia. She's asking about current trends, and she's asking specifically, how do you see the trend towards cloud services impacting software license management?
Very good question and very timely. So with the trend to the cloud, we're dealing with service agreements as opposed to license agreements, although there are sometimes licensing or license elements under those agreements. So the focus is certainly less on license compliance, more on compliance with the agreement overall, including who has authorization to access the cloud-based services, but also internally to understand how those services are being used, how often and by whom, and to track and control the costs, because it's very easy for usage to get out of control. In fact, there doesn't even have to be usage. In some cases, you're charged just based on, for example, the number of employees that are able to access the service. Well, if you could be over-licensed in a sense in that respect, if in fact the actual usage is less than that number of employees. So very much a focus on usage and associated cost, and to make sure that the cost and usage are commensurate with the value.
Excellent. Excellent. Sherry, thank you so much for that. Your passion and expertise in this area are certainly very clear, and I really do appreciate your taking the time to help educate us on this this emerging arena and market. So thanks again, and folks, that's the time that we do have today. There are other questions that have come in, and we'll certainly look to respond to those remaining questions directly to those who asked. For the rest of you, if you do have any other questions or would like any additional information on either Sherry's training services through technology asset management or on the Vizor solution, the IT asset and service software license management solution, please use the contact information on the screen. We'll certainly be happy to reach out and help you in any way that we can. So again, I'd like to thank everybody very much for your time today and wish everybody a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.